I started out as a Middle East guy, and I was interested in every aspect of the Middle East but the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This was something I was very adamant about. I tended to be focused on the relationship between Christianity and Islam. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was, I felt like, territory that had been mined pretty heavily. And there was a presumption when I was going through and I was being taught about the Middle East that everything ran through the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I was sort of skeptical about this as an undergrad. So I really hadn't focused my research on that until I started to realize that somebody had to teach the history and politics of Israel class. And I was the Middle East guy, so that was going to be me. And so I started doing research, and I immediately got hooked. Israel's politics is some of the most interesting politics in the world, I would say, for a number of reasons. And so I know that oftentimes when we have these discussions as Americans, we tend to look at it through our lens, through our domestic lens, either through a lens of what does this mean for Israel's relationship with the United States, or through sort of a Christian lens about which there's a certain amount of controversy. And so I always tell my students when I start the politics of Israel class that they're paying for my political opinions, not my theological opinions. And so we tend not to get into that issue as much. But what you find, I think, when you go deeper and you start to look into what's happening internally in Israel, is that this is one of the most interesting countries in the world in terms of what's happening in its domestic sphere. And a lot of those interesting things that were happening played themselves out in the last two elections. So I want to thank you all for attending Israel Elections Round 2, Electric Boogaloo. And let's get started talking about some of the peculiarities of this. So I'm going to come into this assuming that you're not 100% familiar with how Israel works in terms of its internal domestic politics. Some of you, hopefully for some of you, this is going to be a refresher. And if it is, I apologize. But for those of you who aren't, let's look at some of the details here. The first thing that's really important to know about Israel is the way its electoral system works, because much of Israel's politics is determined by the way its system works. So Israel has what's called a parliamentary system. This means that the Israeli legislature is supreme. They do have an elected president, but it's mostly a ceremonial role, meaning that the Israeli president isn't really the main actor, it's the prime minister. Their parliament is known as the Knesset. There are 120 seats in the Knesset. And they're not elected the way seats are elected here. Okay? So, when you vote for a congressional representative, just a quick American trivia question here. You are voting for a representative of the nation as a whole, or for a representative of your local area when you vote for Congress? Local, correct, right? So you and 700,000 of your closest friends are all voting for someone who's going to represent you in the 435-member Congress. This is not how things are set up in Israel. So Israel votes nationally. When you're voting for you're not voting for an individual member of the Knesset who is sort of sensitive to your local concerns, you're voting as a nation. And they're voting based on a system what's called proportional representation. So you as a voter will cast a vote for a party. Based on the number of votes that party gets, they will get a certain number of seats in the Knesset. And that threshold, if it's above a certain threshold, right? So you have to have a certain percentage of the vote to get any seats at all. And so the parties will put together lists of candidates that are ranked, and depending on how many votes, that's how many of their candidates get in. So Likud, we'll talk about the results here, but just to give you an example of how this works. Likud gets 31 seats. So if you're 30th on Likud's list, congratulations, you're in the Knesset. If you're 33rd, you're out of luck. Now, does anybody want to guess what the impact of proportional representation is on the number of parties in the Knesset? Do you think it makes more parties or fewer parties than we have in our system? Oh, you are so right. So at last count, I believe there are going to be 8 parties represented in the Knesset. There were 9 that ran for election that had a serious chance of getting in. Now, if you've got this many parties, what do you think the likelihood is that one party has an outright majority, meaning that they can govern the country entirely by themselves? High or low? Low, right? So what does that mean? It means you have to form a coalition with a bunch of other parties. This then gets into why Israeli politics has turned into such a hairball in the past year. And so we're going to talk about a couple of different dimensions of this. So a little bit of historical background. When Israel was founded in 1948 by David Ben-Gurion and the other Zionists, Ben-Gurion was kind of on the left end of the Zionist spectrum, right? So he's a Zionist, he's a nationalist, but he's also committed to elements of social democracy. And so the natural inheritors of Ben-Gurion's legacy are the Israeli Labor Party, and they're sort of the dominant force in Israeli politics until the 1980s. This starts to change with the rise of Likud. Likud is sort of a right, initially it's the party of the right, and so there's kind of a little bit of a Labor-Likud duopoly. But around the same time, several of the religious factions within Israel, and we'll talk about the impact of this in a second and who they are, start to get involved and start to play a much larger role in politics. And there are two separate, but for the purposes of what we're talking about today, related religious factions. Okay, and so this makes politics increasingly more complicated. The other big development that has happened since then, that I think is really important in understanding what's happening in Israel right now, is the total collapse of the Israeli left. So the Israeli Labor Party, keep in mind, this used to be the colossus of Israeli politics. Labor had to merge with another party, another small special interest party, in order to cross the threshold to sort of have a campaign that was guaranteed to cross the electoral threshold this time. By the way, the electoral threshold is also very low. It's something like, I think 3.8%, but it's fairly small. So they had to do that to cross the threshold, and they've only got 6 seats in the 120-seat Knesset, right? And this is still the party from which the most Israeli prime ministers have come in terms of number of prime ministers, right? So this is a huge shift in Israeli politics. And what has caused that shift? The collapse of the Oslo peace process. I'm going to assume that everybody is basically familiar with what the Oslo peace process is. Essentially, this is a deal by which Israel and the Palestinians have a degree of mutual recognition. The Palestinian Authority gets some internal autonomy, and the idea is that this is going to improve the security situation. It collapses in kind of the early 2000s with the advent of the Second Intifada, and it really, really collapses officially, like deader than a doornail dead, in 2006, when Hamas wins elections in the Palestinian territories and essentially becomes in control of Gaza. Hamas is completely uninterested in Israel's right to exist. They're not even interested in the process, and so the Israeli public essentially decides we have no legitimate partner for peace. The Israeli left had been very invested in the Oslo process, and so when it collapsed, their political fortunes did as well. So when we talk about disputes and the key factions that are fighting over the future of Israel right now, these are all factions that are on either the right or the center-right of Israeli politics. Now, left-right in Israel is not defined in purely economic terms, and not entirely defined in social terms either. So for us in our politics, when we think of conservative versus right versus left, we think of the right as sort of free market economics and traditional moral values, and we think of the left as more interventionist economics and progressive values. In Israel, left and right tends to be primarily security oriented. So you would find some parties that are on the right in terms of security that have fairly progressive social views or fairly left-wing economic views. So what does the right have in common? And then we'll get into breaking down some of the key factions on the right. The right tends to be very committed to the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. Hold that thought, we're going to come back to it because it's important. Right? But they're all very committed to Israel as a Jewish state. Number two, they are all deeply skeptical of the peace process and do not trust the current Palestinian authority or structures as a partner for peace. Okay, so that's the second thing. Number three, most of these factions would favor some form of territorial expansion of Israel's sovereign territory. Okay, so that's something that they all tend to support. And finally, I think all of them would be deeply skeptical of Iran, see Iran as a major security threat, and would want to see Israel take a strong stance against Iran. Okay, so what this means for the US, and I'll talk about this in more length later or in the Q&A, is that we're not looking at, regardless of who wins, a dramatic shift in the relationship between the United States and Israel. Okay, that relationship is something that's important to everyone, certainly on the right, and even really was important on the left as well, but it is something that is probably not going to see any major changes, although if Netanyahu is no longer prime minister, there might be some changes in terms of personality, and we'll talk about that as we get into this. Right, so that's common ground. So if they have all of these things in common, what divides these factions on the right? And I would argue the most important dividing factors are twofold. Number one, what do they think of Netanyahu? Number two, and this is even more fundamental, and I would say is really what has caused the most recent election that we had. What does it mean to say when we say that someone is Jewish? Okay, so we have Jewish identity, and what do you think of Netanyahu? So let's go over the differences real quick. Netanyahu has been prime minister for 10 years, and one of the things about being a leader for that long is that it gets increasingly complicated to differentiate yourself from some of the things that are going on in the state. You become very enmeshed in some things. Netanyahu is also a very strong personality, and he has family members who are strong personalities and who are quite controversial, not just on the left, but even on the right. And some of this goes into personality, and I can get into the gory details of Sarah Netanyahu, who is Netanyahu's wife, and her relationship with Ayelet Shaked, who is the head of one of the right-wing parties, who essentially Netanyahu's wife kicked Shaked out of Likud because she was young, attractive, and considered a potential threat to her husband. So politics always sometimes comes down to personalities, and there's a lot of that involved in this. Okay, so all of these figures on the right have had a complex history with Netanyahu, all of them except for Benny Gantz, who is the leader of Kahol Lavan, or Blue and White, have been in government with Netanyahu in the past. But there's increasing fatigue with Netanyahu. He's been accused of corruption. He's actually facing indictments. He claims that this is a criminal leftist conspiracy. You know, there aren't a lot of leftists left, so it might just be, you know, he might be right that it's a conspiracy of people who don't like him, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are leftists. It's hard to kind of sift through the wheat and the chaff on the corruption stuff, but there's a lot of it. There's a lot of smoke, and he is going to be facing these indictments and has taken the indictments very seriously. So Netanyahu's ultimate goals are two things. Number one, survival. Number two, staying out of jail. And those two things are intimately linked. So as long as he's prime minister by Israeli law, he cannot go to jail. And so he needs to stay prime minister at just about any cost. On the other hand, there's a substantial faction of Netanyahu that tends to agree with him on policy, but is tired of him personally and is ready to move on and thinks that Israel needs a change. So that leads to Netanyahu's main rival, Benny Gantz, who is the leader of a, I would say, broadly center-right coalition called Kahol Lavan, or Blue and White. And there are a couple of defining aspects of Gantz. But the main one is Gantz's coalition and the people that are attached to him have one basic slogan: time for Bibi to go. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. This is a party and a movement that is fueled by fatigue with Netanyahu. Right, and so all of that seems fairly straightforward. And so when the various parties of the right won a majority, which they certainly did in the last, after the last elections, it certainly seemed as though Netanyahu was on a path to a 63-seat majority, which would be a narrow government, but one that should work. And I think if you were here last time, you might have remembered me saying the most likely outcome is that Netanyahu is going to stay on as prime minister, with a caveat that there was one person who could really throw a wrench into the works for Netanyahu. And that person is Avigdor Lieberman. And this brings us into the second question: what does it mean to be Jewish? And this is what's caused Israel's political crisis right now. Okay, so when we're talking about Jewish identity in Israel, the government has sent strongly mixed messages in history. On the one hand, in terms of aliyah, or immigration to Israel, Jewish identity is defined ethnically. Okay? So the ethnic standard that was applied to the Jews during the Holocaust was that if you had one Jewish grandparent, you were considered a Jew by the Nazis. And so Ben Gurion, I would say quite reasonably, when the state is formed, said, well, if the Nazis were willing to kill someone for being Jewish, then we will consider them Jewish in terms of immigration. Right? So that was a perfectly reasonable thing to have done at the time, and it essentially defined Jewishness along ethnic lines. However, at the same time, Ben Gurion, though he was not religious himself, saw the protection of Orthodox Judaism as an important part of Israel and its project. So he enshrined certain protections and privileges for the then relatively small ultra-Orthodox population. They would be exempt from the draft, they would receive certain subsidies from the government, and they would essentially have a protected status in Israel. Okay? Now, at the time, there were about 400 men in the Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox community, that were applying for this. Now there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. The ultra-Orthodox population has grown. both through immigration and through the fact that the ultra-Orthodox have the highest fertility rates in Israel, and actually the second highest in the region, behind only Gaza, which is controlled by Hamas, so that's a factor. And so now they're a much larger population, or segment of the population. They are intensely resented by secular Israelis, not only for their privileges, but because the ultra-Orthodox define Judaism in terms of religion, right? What makes you a Jew? Following the law of the Torah, and following the law of the Torah to the exacting standards of the ultra-Orthodox and their rabbis. Okay? Now, does anybody know, here's a trick question. How do you get married in Israel? Does anybody know the answer?
Don't you have to be an Orthodox Jew, and if you're not, you have to go to Cyprus?
Okay, that's close. Okay, so you have to be married by a rabbi. Or if you're, funnily enough, if you're a non-Jewish citizen, so an Arab Israeli, you have to be married in a religious court of either Christianity or Islam. Yes, Israel does have Islamic courts. We can talk about that more later if somebody's interested in it, but that's a fun little thing, and you can actually look it up and find the Israeli Islamic courts on their justice ministry. So, what that means is, let's say that you're a secular Jew. Your parents came here from Russia, to Israel from Russia, right? And you want to get married, and you want to get married to a woman. Neither of you have set foot in a synagogue in your life. The Israeli state considers you Jewish citizens, right? You're citizens, but you got to go to an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. And the ultra-Orthodox rabbi says, oh, you're descended from the Kohanim. And by our Torah law, this woman that you want to marry is not Jewish. Because according to the Torah, Jewish descent has to come from the mother, right? So you can't marry her. She's a non-Jew. Marriage denied. So what do you do in that situation? You have to go to Cyprus, because that's the only place you can actually get a civil marriage, right? So we've been having a marriage fight in the United States about whether civil marriage should be extended to same-sex couples. Israel is having a fight about whether they should have civil marriage. So this has become a big issue, and these privileges for the ultra-Orthodox are an issue. There's another faction in the religious side called the religious Zionists. And these are people who actually are advocating for things like not having civil marriage, advocating for the use of religious law as the foundation of the Israeli state. The ultra-Orthodox don't so much care about the state enforcing religious law. They want to protect their own position and their privileges, right? So the ultra-Orthodox are less concerned with the nature and character of the Israeli state. They want to protect themselves. The religious nationalists tend to be overrepresented in the settler area. They want an explicitly religious state. Now, that's one side of things. On the other side, you have Avigdor Lieberman. And Avigdor Lieberman is also a nationalist, but he represents the Russian Jewish community who came in the 1980s and 1990s, and he is an ethnic nationalist. So he defines Judaism in ethnic terms. What makes you a Jew? Ethnicity, right? So he is very skeptical of, and in fact has in the past explicitly said that he does not think Arabs can truly be good citizens of Israel, right? He assumes that there's dual loyalties and wants all Arab citizens of Israel to take loyalty oaths. On the other hand, he's also very against the privileges of the religious because they cut against his definition of the state as an ethnic nationalist state. So he wants the state to be fully secularized. So what happened in April is that Lieberman, who actually only had 5 seats, he was a fairly small player, but he had 5 seats that Netanyahu absolutely needed to form a government. And so Lieberman basically came back to Netanyahu and said, okay, you want immunity from prosecution? That's fine. I want essentially the secularization of Israel, right? We need to talk about the fact that these Haredi men are not getting drafted. We need to talk about civil marriage. We need to talk about the fact that there's no public transportation on Shabbat, because there's no public transportation in Israel on Shabbat, at all. And so Lieberman said, if you don't do these things, I'm out of the government. The problem was, Netanyahu also needed the religious nationalists and the ultra-Orthodox, who were not interested at all in essentially sacrificing their reasons for existence to protect Netanyahu. Hence, Netanyahu was unable to form a coalition, hence the second election. So that's the context. Now, let's go through real quickly, since I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so I'm going to try to finish up here in the next 15 to 20 minutes, right? So I'm going to go through what happened. All right, the first result that's important to note is that Likud which is Netanyahu's party, had a weaker result. They had won fewer votes in the second election than they won in the first election. Okay, Likud plus the party that they merged in, and they actually took in a couple of smaller parties after the last election, had 39 seats. Now they're down to 31. They lost several 100,000 votes, both from people staying away, and a lot of their voters stayed home. And it also seems like Arab turnout was up, so as a percentage, their voters were a smaller percentage. Okay, so this is not what Netanyahu was hoping would happen. He was hoping that he would get a mandate to be able to form a coalition without Lieberman. That is certainly not possible, and in fact is less possible now than it would have been after the last election. Kahol Lavan, which is the coalition, Benny Gantz's coalition, was slightly strengthened.
There's water on the shelf right below your right hand.
Perfect. So Kahol Lavan is slightly strengthened and is more center-right. What I mean by that is some of the voters that went to blue and white last time went back home to the traditional left-wing parties that they went for. So in April, a lot of them tactically voted for blue and white because they were just so sick of Bibi that they were willing to essentially vote for somebody who was not in agreement with them on major core issues just to get rid of Bibi. If you're an American, this probably sounds somewhat familiar because all of us have faced that choice recently, regardless of which party we're in, right? So those tactical voters went home because they were afraid that the left-wing parties were going to fall completely below the threshold. That didn't happen, but blue and white seems to have picked up some voters from the right. They also picked up some Arab voters. So I was listening to a podcast from Haaretz, which is the main newspaper in Israel, and they were talking about how in the most heavily Druze, the Druze are an Arab-Israeli sect, a community that belongs to a minority sect of Islam, but in the heavily Druze cities, they voted heavily for blue and white. And that is interesting because they have occasionally voted for Likud in the past. They have also voted sometimes for the Arab nationalist parties, but they went, or the Arab list. They went to blue and white. Okay. The other really interesting result here is that the joint Arab list increased their percentage of the vote. And this is interesting because they are now essentially larger as a percentage of the Knesset than both of the traditional Israeli left-wing parties combined. So Labor and Meretz, which is a party that's further to the left of Labor but still Zionist, won 11 seats. The Joint Arab List got 13. Okay? The problem with the Joint Arab List is that it's a joint Arab list, so it's a coalition of all of the different Arab parties. So there's some parties that are willing to work within the system. There are other parties that are kind of see the Israeli system as somewhat illegitimate because they feel like it doesn't represent them enough, and some of them have a, let's just say, less than firm commitment to Israel's right to exist. So the Arab nationalist joint list is a huge, huge space in terms of the wide variety of their political views. But the figure to watch here is Ayman Odeh. He is the head of the Arab, I would say the joint Arab list. And he is interesting because more than a lot of Arab leaders in the past, Odeh has shown a willingness to play the Israeli game, to define himself as an Israeli citizen, and to try to work within the structure of Israeli politics. And that's an interesting development if it continues, and if that tends to be the attitude that Arab voters want. And by the way, the splitting of the Arab list and the fact that a lot of the Arab political parties were saying they weren't going to even support Gantz, who was getting rid of Netanyahu, caused a massive drop in Arab turnout because Arab voters were disgusted by that and just completely fed up with it. The fact that the list came back together and Odeh said that he would be more involved and potentially even back a candidate for prime minister led to a spike in Arab turnout. So my inner political scientist is telling me that actually this is probably what Arab voters want. They want to be part of the system. They want to work within the system of Israel to make their lives better. And for the general stability of Israel, that's a good thing. All right, Lieberman and his party, Israel Batenu, which is the ethno-nationalist party, actually jumped. So they went from 5 seats to 9 seats. So if we thought Lieberman was a kingmaker before, he's even more of a kingmaker now. And that means that his joint tactics of, number one, poking Netanyahu in the eye, and number two, running explicitly against the religious parties worked. So if you're in the religious parties, the fact that Lieberman, who was essentially running explicitly against you, almost doubled his number of seats, has to be very alarming. The national religious parties lost a significant number of votes. The ultra-Orthodox gained, actually, seats in this election. However, they're now in a much weaker position because there are enough people in both Kahol Lavan and Yisrael Beitenu, who are two of the parties that you kind of need to form a coalition, who are not necessarily favorably inclined toward them. So they are in a position now potentially of being shut out of government, which, given the push for secularization, could be disastrous for them. Right? So this is a potential crisis for those two religious nationalist movements. The other group that I would say is in crisis is the left. They will possibly have more influence because they could help Gantz form a coalition. However, they've not increased their seat total and their vote total. And they seem like, at this point, they are just going to be a minor player in Israel moving forward. Maybe they can leverage that into gaining some of what they want. Minor parties have done it effectively before, but it's a huge come down from where they were before the Second Intifada. So real quickly, let me just go through a couple of possible outcomes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Right? So the first possible outcome is what Avigdor Lieberman essentially said that he wanted when he started this election, which is a national unity government between blue and white, Likud, and Yisrael Beitenu. This would be a broadly right-to-center-right government. It would not be explicitly tied to the religious parties. It could potentially pursue some of what Lieberman wants in terms of secularization. And it would have a lot of seats. So Kahol Lavan has 33, Netanyahu has 31, Yisrael Beitenu has 9. So this is a stable government that could actually govern comfortably for most of its term. Because again, if the government does not have a majority, can no longer command the majority, you have a vote of no confidence, which means you have another election. Right? So this would be a stable government. The hang up here is Netanyahu. Right? Gantz and Blue and White have basically said we will not go into any unity government with Netanyahu. They want a unity government in which Likud ditches Netanyahu. Netanyahu, of course, does not want that. One scenario that some people have floated is what's essentially called the Nixon option. This is that Netanyahu resigns and gets an immunity deal. Essentially, he resigned and he is pardoned by whoever becomes the next prime minister for any indictments that may come down on him or his family. Right, so that's a possibility. That is certainly something that could happen. Netanyahu's folks have said, we are absolutely not willing to do this. To me, that sounds like an opening negotiating bid, because if it's a choice between that or having a third election, which we'll talk about why that might be bad for him in a second, or going to jail, I think he probably is enough of a pragmatist to take that option and live to fight another day. So that is one possible option. The other possible option is that you could try to see a coalition of the left or the right. The problem is the math doesn't add up. And the reason the math doesn't add up for either side is Avigdor Lieberman. Okay? If you remember earlier, I said there are two groups that he really doesn't like: Arab Israelis and the religious parties. Okay? The left coalition, which would actually not be that far left because it would mean blue and white in charge and they're really a center-right party, but sort of the center to center-left coalition, would have to rely on the votes of the Joint Arab List. They would have to, at a minimum, provide supply, which means we're not going to be in government, but we will vote to uphold the government on what are called confidence measures, measures that require a majority to pass. Lieberman has said he won't work with them. On the right, Netanyahu certainly can't go into an exclusively right-wing government without the ultra-Orthodox and the religious nationalists. Lieberman has also said he won't work with them. So Lieberman has the balance of power, and he won't work with either of the groups that would make it possible for the left or the right to govern on their own. So what does that leave? If it's not this Lieberman option, this coalition Lieberman wants, we're probably looking at Israeli elections round 3 if we can't form a government. It's a very realistic possibility, but there are a couple of reasons why nobody wants it. First of all, at a certain point, the voters are just going to get annoyed and not show up. Second of all, Bibi Netanyahu's coalition lost significant support from the first election to the second election. And as much as he's going to try to blame it on Lieberman, Gantz, the Arabs, and just about anybody else, the Israeli voters, if they're tired of the political process, just inevitably, if you're frustrated with politics, you're going to take it out on the incumbent. Right? So chances that Bibi loses more support in the third election are pretty high. Finally, there have been a lot of concerns about the idea of sort of Israel's democracy. And so a third election would, I think, maybe potentially undermine that and bring that issue more to the forefront. Nevertheless, it is a distinct possibility. And if that happens, we'll have to decide whether we're going to do one of these again. So I will just give you a couple of quick broad implications of this. Number one, the unresolved issue of what it means to be a Jew is going to vex Israeli politics until it is resolved. So Israel's national identity itself is very ambivalent and not fixed. And there are competing nationalisms on the Israeli right, and that's going to continue to divide Israeli politics. The second implication, the Arabs have an opportunity. They have a chance to play an unprecedented role as Arab parties explicitly. There have been Arab cabinet ministers, but Arab parties have never been in government before. So they've got an unprecedented role, a chance to play a role, and that in and of itself would have implications for Israel's national identity, and it would complicate things for everyone. However, there are both dangers and difficulties that remain. The Arab parties are very disunited. They have a complex relationship both with Israel's government and with the various Palestinian groups in the West Bank and Gaza. And so there's an opportunity, but there's also potentially a lot of risk. After all, demagoguery against the Arab parties and sort of opposition to the Arab parties, kind of like opposition to different religious groups on the left and the right, or even different political groups on the left and the right here, is always a vote winner among certain segments of the population. Right? So they have an opportunity, they need to be careful. The third implication is that Bibi's time may be running out. This is probably the grimmest situation Netanyahu has faced in his political career. However, one thing that we can say about Netanyahu is that he is a survivor, and so he can't entirely be counted out. The final implication, I would say, and this is the one that's the most US-centric, I don't expect any major changes in terms of the US relationship with Israel. I don't expect any major changes in terms of Israel's strategic position. And I certainly don't anticipate, for example, that a new government that comes into power is going to somehow be have a dramatically worse relationship with President Trump, or a dramatically different relationship with a different American president if Trump loses in 2020. However, there is one thing to be a little bit cautious about, and that is this. We know that President Trump, in terms of foreign policy, tends to be very personalistic. What I mean by that is his personal relationships that he has with foreign leaders are very important, and that is a way and a means by which he does foreign policy. Netanyahu has really played on that in electoral terms in Israel. Essentially, he's kind of claimed to be the Trump whisperer. Netanyahu's American presence, I'm sure you are all aware of this, he speaks impeccable English. He's very, very well educated, and the persona that he's crafted in the United States is incredibly popular. Benny Gantz certainly has a compelling background as a former general in the IDF, but his English is not quite as good, he's not quite as dynamic, and it's possible that he might not quite have the same personal relationship with Trump. Where this comes into play is that Trump's other BFF in the Middle East is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. And MBS really wants Trump to come out with a peace plan so that MBS can essentially argue that he is now the Trump whisperer and he's looking out for the Arab Street. And so everybody should just ignore what's happening in Yemen and really take the hard anti-Iranian line that he wants. Trump may, if Netanyahu is not there, feel more pressure to come out with a peace plan, and he may also think that as the ultimate deal maker, solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2020 right before an election will guarantee him both re-election and, as he said he wanted this morning, a Nobel Prize. So would that be a dramatic change? It's hard to say, but it is certainly a possibility worth watching if Netanyahu is no longer prime minister. All right, so that's all I have in terms of the presentation. Thanks for your attention. And hit me with your best questions.
How long does it take between round 1, round 2, and 2 and 3?
So round 1, round 2.
And who makes the decision?
Okay, so good question. So first of all, round 1 and round 2. Round 1 happened in April. Round 2 obviously was in September. So we're probably looking at 4 or 5 months from the point at which, well, actually I think, no wait. Yeah, so it took them a month to not form a government. So we're looking at basically a 3-month election window. So Israel's election season by law is 3 months long. So assuming they can't form a government, probably be mid-October. So we'd be looking at elections January, February next year, which would just happen to be right when I'm teaching 612, which is history and politics of Israel. So it could be very interesting times. Who makes that decision? So the president has very few actual political roles, but one of them like the Queen in the Israeli or in the British system, is that he invites the person who he thinks has the best chance of forming government to try and form a government. If they fail, somebody else gets a chance. If they fail, then he says no government can be formed, and it's time for an election. So ultimately, the president is the one who makes the formal decision. In practice, informally, that decision is made by the different parties if they can't come to an agreement about how the government is going to be structured.
Other questions?
What is the, what do you anticipate would be the Arab population in 25 years, 50 years, given the politics?
Oh man, first of all, that's a good question because that really depends on two-state solution versus one-state solution, how much Israel expands, whether it expands into Area C, which is a part of the West Bank, or just the Jordan Valley, or beyond that. What I will say is that for both Israel and the Palestinian population, the populations that are having the highest birth rates are the populations that are the least committed to a two-state solution. So on the one hand, you have very high birth rates in Gaza, which is dominated by Hamas. On the other hand, you have very high birth rates in Israel among the population that tends to vote for either the religious nationalist parties or the ultra-Orthodox. So we're probably looking at a demographic reality in which if you want a two-state solution, and whether a two-state solution is a good idea or not is kind of a separate question. But if you want a two-state solution, demographically it probably needs to happen relatively soon because it does not look based on future demographic trends as though that's where the majority of people are going to be. Now, obviously, your parents don't necessarily determine your political views. People can disaffiliate. People can kind of change their perspectives. But kind of demographically, that's, I would say, what we're looking at.
If Netanyahu doesn't win again, what do you think Israel's future is going to look like?
So probably not that different in the sense of its security posture. I don't expect the left to really come back. I don't think Benny Gantz is going to really, differentiate too much from Netanyahu in terms of the grand strategy or major things. There may be more of a tilt away from the influence of the religious parties. There may be a push for some of the secularization stuff if it's a Likud, blue and white, Yisrael Beitenu coalition. And that could have interesting implications for both the ultra-Orthodox and the religious nationalists. Those are groups that have, by the way, historically, really not liked each other. The ultra-Orthodox were not Zionists. They were not committed to the idea that a Jewish state was either necessary or something that they should be building. But you could see those groups get pushed more together. You could also see kind of an alliance between some of the ultra-Orthodox and some of the Arab nationalists. What I mean by that is Shas, which is the bigger of the two ultra-Orthodox parties, is dominated by Mizrahi Jews. So these are Jews who are essentially of Arab and Sephardic descent, right? They tend to be very religious, but they're not super Zionist, and there's a little bit of ethnic tension between Mizrahi Jews and the Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazi are seen as sort of wealthier, more elite, more having dominated Israel. So I could certainly see, and Ayman Odeh has kind of hinted that he might try to do this. I could see someone on the Arab side being really clever and saying there are enough commonalities between Arabs and Arabic Jews, or Jews of Arabic descent, that we should form kind of a united front against this dominance of our state by the sort of ethnic Ashkenazi. And that's one of the real risks of Lieberman's vision is you potentially, okay, so you're going to say Jewishness is ethnic, but Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews have some ethnic tension. So how are we defining Jewishness here? Because that could potentially cause some, I think, unintended consequences as well.
So if Netanyahu is not the next person to form a government, some of the people you've mentioned sounds like they kind of only have their clout because they control enough minority to keep a government from forming. But who do you think might be the person who can form a government down the road if it's not Netanyahu?
So if Likud dumps Netanyahu, Benny Gantz is probably initially the first person who would be prime minister. I could see Likud easily falling behind blue and white because, again, the ideological differences between Likud and blue and white are not that huge. Blue and white is sort of a catch-all centrist party. It's funny because the name of it in Hebrew is Kahol Lavan, but it's Kahol is K-A-C-H-O-L. So if you pronounce it in English, it kind of sounds like catch-all, and that's really what they are. But they're more right or center right, and so a deal between them and Likud pretty much makes sense. I think Gantz would probably be the person who would initially lead that. However, there are a lot of up-and-coming folks on the Likud side, people like Gidon Sar, Gilad Erdan is one that I've heard of, even Ayelet Shaked. Now, Shaked is currently the head of Yamina, which is the religious nationalist list, but she's a Likudnik originally. And I could very easily see, if Netanyahu's gone, Shaked swooping in, trying to get herself made head of Likud and position herself to be prime minister. She's very ambitious, she's very politically ruthless, and she's smart. And she's actually a lot more popular than some of her other allies on the religious nationalist side. So her moving over is not totally crazy. An outside figure who might be worth watching, although it's not 100% clear to me whether some of his machinations have damaged his appeal, is Moshe Kahlon. He used to be the head of a party called Kulanu, which was right on security issues, left on economic issues, and represented the Mizrahi community. I could see Kahlon trying to be a power broker as well, and trying to make a deal. But I would say initially it's probably Gantz, and the politics in Likud is going to be, well, I don't know if anybody's seen Game of Thrones, but you know how the struggle went after Robert Baratheon passed away and everybody was going for the throne. You could see that kind of Game of Thrones style situation in Likud afterwards.
Yeah. All right, we have time for one more question, I think. Is anybody else?
Could you make some general comments, maybe specific comments about where do you think Iran's objectives are?
Absolutely.
And where do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so Iran's objectives vis-a-vis Israel, or vis-a-vis the Middle East generally, or both?
The Middle East.
Okay. Iran, in my view, is a revisionist power that wants to construct a regional hegemony based on their particular view of revolutionary political Islam. I mean, to me, all of that's pretty self-explanatory and self-evident. They're using Israel as the enemy against which they're trying to define themselves. And part of the way that they have tried to gain legitimacy in the rest of the Muslim world is by supporting proxies against Israel, particularly Hamas and Hezbollah. There are a couple of challenges to that. Number one is that Saudi Arabia is basically a status quo power. So status quo power is power that doesn't really want anything to change. They're happy with the way things are. Israel is also, and pretty much always has been, a status quo power. People kind of don't necessarily grasp this about the Israelis, but the Israelis do not like change in the Middle East because, as far as they're concerned, change is bad and could be an existential threat. So they tend to be a status quo power. They don't like a lot of change. They were very nervous about the Arab Spring, even before some of the things went down the way they did. So, so Iran has essentially now created an alliance of status quo powers. The other thing the Iranians need to watch out for is the Turks, because the Turks are essentially trying, right now in my view, to push into the same space. They are trying to construct a regional hegemony based on their slightly different view of political Islam, which is more rooted in their Ottoman past. So there's kind of a war within the political Islamic camp. By the way, Turkey is also Sunni, Iran is Shia. That makes a difference in terms of where these different factions are going to line up. And the Turks are really pushing Iran for influence in some of the factions like Hamas. Iran, of course, has an in with Hezbollah because Hezbollah is Shia, but Hamas is not. And so I can see the Turks trying to pry that segment away from Iran. And of course, the final thing with Iran is the United States. Iran views the United States as the great Satan, as its sort of perennial enemy. And as long as the Iranian regime is as it currently is, that's not going to change. But they've got a lot of internal domestic instability. And part of the reason they're pushing the nuclear thing is because the nuclear program is actually the most popular thing internally that the mullahs are doing, because it's seen as sort of a sign of Persian greatness. And so I think the Iranian regime is an existential threat to Israel. I think it's a threat to the status quo of the in the Middle East, which is not great from a US perspective, but is better than the alternative Iran is offering. And so I think the Iranian regime really needs to be the focus of a strong effort of not only containment, but I would favor some sort of very careful and covert support for democratization in Iran. Because if Iran democratizes, even if that democracy is not perfect and isn't 100% pro-American, but is just really focused on more fixing Iran and tending to its own knitting, that's a huge game changer for the US and for Israel in the region. So that's kind of my very 50,000-foot strategic overview vis-a-vis Iran. I think from the Israeli perspective, they're just concerned about containment. Again, they're a status quo power. They're very cautious about any kind of broad sweeping change. And so from their perspective, if the Iranian threat can be successfully contained, that's all they really need to see.
Can I follow? Will there be a coalition, you think, against Iran?
Not a military one. Nobody wants to go into Iran militarily. This is a thing that people say, well, the alternative is this or war. Well, nobody's really talking about going to war with Iran because it's a very complex and dicey proposition. Will there be a coalition to contain Iran and try to roll back its gains in the region? I would say there already is one. The US, Israel, the Saudis, the other Gulf states, Egypt, and Jordan are part of it. The Turks are kind of moving away from it. They're moving to a new sort of third position. And that is very concerning from a US perspective. Probably also concerning from an Israeli perspective because the Turks like to take cheap shots at Israel as a way of ginning up the Muslim street. And so, there is a coalition. Is that coalition strong enough to succeed? I would say time will tell.